Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this is my glow-in-the-dark clay. In the past I've made a few things using this stuff, but my most favoritist of said things was Wendy the Irradiated Shark, and in the spirit of starting the new year with a bang, I figured I'd turn this lump of glow-in-the-dark clay into a happily irradiated alligator. I'll start as you do by building the body of my gator out of a log of lead foil to keep Kyle the alligator's guts from turning to mush, but if you haven't got a good lead-based foil, you can probably make do with a slightly less effective aluminium. Once I've got a shiny alligator-shaped shape, I can slap the initial layer of clay on top, covering all of the exposed foil before sticking a tail in place on the back and a head-shaped lump on the front. I'll then fatten up the body and work my way around the head, adding little lumps to the neck to build up the radiation-related gator goiters, as well as thickening up and reshaping the jaw. Then once I've built up the bony protrusion of the snout, I can add some little lumps here and there until I've got a slightly more refined gator head. Now, the alligator enthusiasts among you are probably already writing angry comments on how the shape of this head is much more crocodilian in design and, well, yeah, absolutely, but I much prefer saying gator to croc, and I sculpt in silence, so I wasn't aware of this until I started recording, and I'm just gonna keep going. To make Kyle's eyes, I'll poke some little divots into the side of the head and fill them with some pre-baked balls of glow-in-the-dark clay, building up the shape of the eyelids as I go, before poking some breathing holes into the front of the snout. To make the mouth, I'll mark it out with a scalpel before opening it in its entirety with a big old box cutter. Some more little lumps of clay strategically placed around the face will give the upper and lower jaw an appropriately shaped shape, into which I can start fitting some more pre-baked teeth. With the teeth in place, I can add some texture to Kyle's gum line in the top of his head, as well as adding some lumpy lumps to his chunky neck, before moving back to his back to add his dorsal ridging by rolling a ball stylus back and forth to delineate the individual rows of lumpy protrusions. Once the rows are in place, I'll use a curved chisel to reshape the rows into individual square scales, texturing and shaping as I work my way down to the tip of his tail, where I'll add some long wormy dealies along the length of the tail to create the more pronounced spiky bits on his back end. Once I've turned the long tail-length noodles into more back spikes, I can begin to texture the body with lots of little scales. I'll start by carving vertical lines from each of the larger spikes on Kyle's tail, before pressing some big divots for future legs. I can then continue adding my vertical lines until I've covered the majority of Kyle's body, at which point I can start to add the horizontal lines, which will leave me with lots of little square, gator-like scales. With the scales in place, I can wrap Kyle in some cling film and break out my pre-made pimple roller, which I'll roll over Kyle's body to add that last little bit of lumpy, bumpy, scaly texture. Then it's into the oven to bake before filling those pre-poked leg holes with some pre-bent leg lumps that I can blend into the rest of the body. To make his little alligator toes, I'll snip the tips of his feet into an appropriate-ish number of toes that I can twist and bend into the correct shape before doing some final reshaping of the legs and adding the necessary alligator scales on top so they match the rest of the body. Then all that's left is a last bit of cling film bump texturing, and it's into the oven to bake one final time. Kyle is actually an albinogator, so I don't need to worry about coloring him at all, but I will wash him with a very thin layer of umber ink to help highlight some of the scales and textures, dabbing away the excess, as well as giving his head a bit of red that can be dabbed away as well. With that though, Kyle is looking pretty terrific, so I can set him aside and make some discarded barrels of radioactive waste by taking this length of wooden dowel and breaking it into 3 roughly equal sections. I'll then wrap these little wooden barrels in some clay so that I can turn them into impromptu little gray metal barrels, but while I do that, I'd like to tell you about today's sponsor, honey. No, I'm just kidding. Can you imagine though? I mean, I bet there is some unfortunate YouTuber out there who's fully recorded their advertiser segment and was ready to upload it just as the internet realized how stinky a company they are, and now this poor gormless vlogger is left to wonder how they're going to pay their bills this week. I guess the moral of the story is that, well, I guess Markiplier is the ethical lodestone of YouTube. Honestly though, if you can't trust a shady internet company that offers you free money in exchange for installing a sketchy app on every device you own, then, I mean, who can you trust? Otherwise, at this point, I've made myself a set of 3 little metal clay barrels ready for a coat of paint. To save what little sanity I have left, I'll use my airbrush to give the barrels an initial coat of yellow before turning to the hairbrush to paint the inner ring onto which I can add a little black circle with a littler black dot that will, with the help of a not-so-steady hand, become the universally identifiable radioactive symbol. I can then work my way around the rest of the barrel, adding an initial dark rust-colored rust followed by a lighter rust-colored rust followed by a final tickling of a steel-colored metallic paint to make the barrels look nice and tarnished. Of course, Kyle and his radioactive barrels are gonna need some place to hang out, which means it's time to build a riverbed. Now, the initial positioning of the barrels was done with the intention of embedding them in the bottom of the riverbed, but in the interest of saving material and doubling my irradiated barrel investment, I realized that by cutting the barrels in half, which you can't see but I just did air quotes when I said that, I can actually double the number of barrels and significantly reduce the amount of material I'll need to bury said barrels. To bury my barrels, I'll paint the base in a thick layer of bacon bond so I can slop a slab of clay on top to create the riverbed beneath Kyle. I can then press the barrels into the base of the bed and add some clay around the edges, which then makes it look like the barrels are semi-submerged. Then using a rock, I can texturize the base of the riverbed so it's less smooth and clay-like before using my knife in the edge of the MDF base to square off all the sides. Finally, before I bake the riverbed, I wanted to add a bit more irradiated clay, so I'll take some little lumps and roll and pinch them until they look like little seaweed or whatever it is that you call seaweed that's found in a river. I'll poke some little divots into my gray clay base so I can fit the riverweeds in place, adding a fair few little leafy bits by the exposed barrels, as well as making some slightly smaller grass-like little leafy living lumps of irradiated underwater foliage. With the albino riverweeds in place, I'll bake the base then paint the gray clay brown so that any exposed bits are less obvious when I cover it with a layer of fine brown sand and little river rocks. To hold all the loose material in place, I'll douse the base with a heavy dose of isopropyl alcohol, which will make the subsequent layer of watered down PVA glue soak nicely into the sand and stone. Otherwise, after a few hours, the base is nice and solid, so I can paint the rim black and set it aside while I make the resin form. Now, it's been a hot minute since I've made a resin model, but I happen to have a piece of 5mm Perspex that I can score and snap using a sharp knife, the edge of my table, and a thick piece of MDF to brace. Then it's on to my absolute favorite part of any resin project, removing the film from the Perspex sheets. Now with Perspex cut to size, I can start building the frame using hot glue in the square edge of the base to help me align everything correctly. Of course, this is my first project of the year and it's resin, so I'd really rather limit the possible points of failure. So after I built the resin box, I decided to remake it with a proper base, as well as pour an initial layer of resin over the riverbed to make sure it wasn't leaking at all and to seal the sand and rocks. With that though, I'm all set to start mixing my resin. Using the power of math, I've figured out how much resin I'll need and marked out the correct measurements on my bucket. Now the resin I use is a 2-part epoxy that can be measured either by weight or volume, so I like to do both, marking out the volume and double checking with the scale. Before I add the watercolored pigment though, I want to pour a little bit of my mixed resin into a separate container, which I'll then tint using some glow-in-the-dark pigment powders. This will be a bit of a radiated goop that's leaked out of the barrels, so I'll add a little green to the resin and make it a bit more irradiated looking by adding a bit of yellow. I can then set this aside for later while I tint my river water with a bit of green and a bit of blue. Of course, after all that mixing, my resin is looking awfully bubbly, so I'm going to need to break out my often used, rarely seen resin debubbler. This wonderful little machine is a vacuum chamber that works by extracting all of the air from inside the chamber, thereby essentially removing the vast majority of the air that I inadvertently added to the resin while I was mixing it. Now this is sped up by about 3000%, but you can see how it works. As the pressure increases, the air bubbles up and out of the resin, eventually leaving me with a pretty impressive clear final pot of resin ready to be poured. There are of course some bubbles left over, but these bubbles will dissipate on their own, assuming I don't do anything stupid like leave the resin in an airtight chamber overnight where it can overheat and cure too fast. Foreshadowing. To keep Kyle in place while the resin cures, I'll use some high-strength, nearly invisible fishing line draped across the walls of the box and taped in place. These will fit neatly under Kyle's chin and tail, but once the resin is cured, they should be mostly invisible. However, before I fill the box with river resin, I'll remove Kyle so I can add some little pools of greenish goo around the barrels. I'm hoping the green goo stays mostly in place once I pour the river resin over top, but I have no idea how well it's going to work, so at this point your guess is as good as mine. For now though, there's nothing else to do but pour my river water over top using Kyle's big beefy albino body as a brake to keep the resin from forming too many bubbles as it's poured in. Now, unexpectedly, Kyle's actually lighter than the resin itself, so he started floating up at the back end where I guess the clay is the thinnest, and I had to use a bit of armature wire to keep him held in place. Otherwise, once I've got him properly positioned, I'll add a bit of dried leaves and detritus along the edge of the water so it looks a bit more like a river and it's not quite so boring and flat. Then I can set it aside for 72 hours to cure. Well, except for one thing. You see, my studio space is also my office space, and I'm a little afraid of the long-term health problems associated with resin, so I spent some time making an airtight, clear container that will clearly contain the hella sketchy VOCs that are released while the resin degasses. When it's done curing, I can theoretically take the container outside to release the harmful vapors into the loving embrace of Mother Nature, thereby saving my lungs. However, one thing I kind of forgot to account for was that this particular design doesn't really allow for heat dissipation, and considering how hot resin gets when it cures, well, it kind of turned into a little oven, significantly increasing the speed at which the resin cured. Which, all things considered, wasn't that big an issue. What it does mean though is that there's a lot of extra little bubbles on the bottom from the resin contracting in size as it cures, and a fairly substantial bubble on the backside. However, I kinda like all the little bubbles since they make the scene a little more dynamic, and I actually think I can fix the larger bubble. So once I've removed the bottom and back panels of the mold, I'll cut away the thin top layer of the big bubble and mix up some thinner, quick-setting resin. I'll heat it up by letting the container sit in hot water, then using a pipette I can feed the resin into the bubble, filling it up and mostly hiding it. Any leftover bubbles will just look like the other little bubbles that I liked anyways, and the slight discoloration is mostly on the backside, so I can easily Photoshop that out of the thumbnail. All that's left to do then is free Kyle and his resin river from the rest of the mold, and using a teeny tiny palm plane, remove the flashing from the edges so I don't slice myself open while I try and handle this thing. Finally, using a little bit of UV resin, I can make some ripples forming at the front of Kyle's face, drawing them backwards, so it kinda looks like he's swimming forwards. And with that, I'd say we're all done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, Jeremy Hiley, Josh Saruda, Bitty Bitey Ones, Boop Chonky Boy, David Innes, Millie Henson, Alex Barrett, Caitlin Cloys, Grayson Rowan and Idris, That Joshy Josh, Anna Kelly, Soapy Cooper Super Soup Off Hoop Soak Suds, Asavenya, Mia Krantz, Alex, Multiversal Zero, Scott Anguish, Claire Bear, Lay's Chips, MEFC, Bird, Ruth Has a Tooth, Casper, TFG Animal, Best Dad, Spring Cat Gamin, Delone Biscuit, Julia Kerr, Brandon Bartree, Mr. Buttsticks, and Trina Wake Up, You're Missing the Nightmares. Welcome to 2025, I guess. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.